I know that we enjoy being in the other building where we have room to spread way out and kind of have our own little spaces, but isn't the singing amazing? When we're all together like this. And it's just a blessing to be able to come together. It is a blessing, as I said, to have a facility that we can come to as an alternative when the other building's not available. And we will make an effort, hopefully we're not in here next week, but if we are, we will make an effort to make sure there's more seating available and have things arranged a little bit differently. This is kind of a learning process. So we're just blessed to be able to be together. And to me, this is just an encouragement to have everybody together like this. Did fail to mention in our announcements that there is going to be some help that will be needed when we're ready to start getting things put back together in the other building. Furniture has been moved all over the place. There's some cleaning and things that will need to be done. And so it may be this week. Hopefully it'll be this week. If not, within the next couple weeks. But we'll be getting a message out through text to let you know when we're going to be getting together to try to get everything put back together. And so just be looking for that, and it'll give us an opportunity to serve in some different ways. As we get into our lesson this morning, we are in a sermon series that we've entitled Facing Giants. And we recognize that there are a number of giants in this life that can get you. If we let them, these giants will master us and become a giant situation in our life. A number of things that can just kind of overtake our lives if we're not careful. And, there's no better place for us to understand this than to look through the life of David. And that's what we've been doing over the last several weeks. We have been in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. And we've been considering the times when David encountered something difficult in his life. And there were times when he conquered those things. And there are other times when these things seemed to conquer him. And today we're going to look at another one of those giants in his life. And that was the giant, or is the giant of ambition. You might be thinking this morning, isn't ambition a good quality to have? In most respects it is, isn't it? We often want to have ambition. And if you ever hear someone use a saying and say, oh, that person lacks ambition, do we consider that to be a positive or a negative? Typically we see that as a negative, right? We want people to be ambitious. As a matter of fact, the definition of the word ambition, if it pops up here, see if it's going to come on the screen. It might be dead here. Hold on. There we go. The definition for the word ambition is the strong desire to achieve or accomplish something, usually including hard work or perseverance. And that seems like a great thing, right? Most of us will look at that and say, well, that's all we need to have, or we all need to have that, and yet it depends on the focus of what you're going after. There are good things that we can go after in life, that we can be ambitious towards, or we can have ambition towards the wrong things in our lives. It also depends on our motive and our method when it comes to ambition. It depends on what we're going after. You might be going after a good thing, but your methods and your motives might be wrong. For example, you may want to be the best employee in your company. That sounds great, right? That's a good ambition to have. But the reason why you want to be the best in your company is you want bragging rights. You want something that you can be proud of. And the way that you go about being the best in your company is kind of knocking down everybody else to get to the top. Well, the ambition of being the best is good, but the motives and the methods are bad. And so our ambition can be a negative. It can be a giant in our lives. I was in school just a couple of years ago at Freed-Hardeman, and I had a fellow student who was a Bible major with me, and we had a lot of classes together. And this guy was just a super dynamic guy. He was one of these that the Bible professors all loved, right? He He was a dynamic speaker. He was super smart. He was just an energetic personality. And he was amazing in the pulpit and preaching. And he was one of these guys that they invited to speak in chapel often. And he had invitations all over Tennessee and Alabama areas to speak in different congregations. Super dynamic guy. He's one of these guys, everybody said, man, he's going to go places. Well, I took a class, Preacher and His Work, with him. And in that class, the professor had asked us, he said, I want everybody, we're going to go around the room, and I want you to tell me, what is your reason for becoming a preacher? And where do you see yourself in 10 years? And there were a lot of different answers, the answers you would expect of saying, well, my motive for preaching is that I want to share the gospel of Jesus, and I want in 10 years I hope to be in the mission field, or I hope to be working with a local congregation, or something like that. We got to this one guy, this super dynamic speaker and all that, and when it came to his turn, he said, well, my motive is that I know I'm really good at this. I have a talent at it, and so I want to use this talent. And where I want to see myself in 10 years is I want to be preaching for a large congregation, and I want to be known throughout the brotherhood. And that was his motive. Now that's ambitious, isn't it? Well, I was talking to a friend another friend that I went to school with recently, and he's a friend of this gentleman. And I asked him, I said, so where is he now? Haven't heard about him in a long time. And he said, well, he's left the church. He's been divorced 3 times. He's caught up in alcoholism. And I said, what happened? And he said, his sole purpose in life was to be known. And so he made a series of bad decisions in his life in an effort to be known that led him down a very dark path. And so there are times when ambition, if we're not careful, can become a tremendous giant in our lives. And so the question we want to ask this morning is, are you ambitious? And if you are, if you have a strong desire for something, is it the right thing? And are you doing it in the right way? Again, ambition doesn't have to be a negative in our lives. But do we have a right motive? Do we have a right purpose? Are we going about it in the right way? David is a great example of this, because as we've been walking through the life of David, we're going to see today, David finds himself in a situation where he's going to face this giant of ambition. We last week got to the point where we saw that Saul, the king of Israel, has been killed. He is now dead at this point in the story. Saul's sons have all been killed, all but one is only remaining. And the nation of Israel has been overrun by the Philistines at this point. And so the nation is kind of in disarray. They have no king. But here's David. He's over in Ziklag, if you remember, with his army of men. He's in Philistine enemy territory. But now David has an opportunity. You see, David had been promised by God. He'd been anointed to be king of Israel, and he had been told, you're going to be the next king of Israel. And here David's been running for 10 years, and now he has a chance. He has the opportunity to assert himself to the throne. This is David's chance. His ambitions can be realized at this point. And so this is the moment he's been waiting for. And we're going to pick up today and look at 2 Samuel chapters 2 through 5. We're going to move very quickly through several chapters today and to look at what happens when we have ambition. The first thing we're going to see this morning is that David's kingdom is established by God's sovereign plan. You see, David had an opportunity to assert himself to the throne. But instead, David allows God's plan to work. Let's look at verse 1 of 2 Samuel 2. And it says, after this, David inquired of the Lord, shall I go up into any of the cities of Judah? And the Lord said to him, go up. David said, to which shall I go? And he said, to Hebron. And so here's David. David could have easily said, man, let's get the army, let's go. I'm the next king of Israel. But instead, David stops and he asks God, should I put myself in a position where your will can be accomplished? Should I do this? And if so, how should I do it? And so he moves up to Hebron, which is one of the cities of Judah. It's in the southern portion of Israel. And what we find in the next few verses is that the men of Judah decide to make David king of Judah. The problem is the other tribes up in the northern part, above that red line, they did not want David to be their king. And so at this point we now have a divided kingdom. We have the southern kingdom, which is going to be controlled for a while by David. And we have the northern kingdom, which is going to be controlled by several different situations we'll see in a moment. But we'll come back to chapter 2. We're going to skip ahead now to chapter 5 for just a moment because we want to see the end result. This is where we started. Let's get to the end result. And the end result was this. Verse 1, it says, then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, behold, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. And the Lord said to you, you shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel. And so what happens, the end result here, is they recognize David to be king over all of Israel. That's the end result, but there's a lot that happens in between all of that. But notice here that David is not recognized for his greatness. Instead, they are recognizing David's right to rule based on God's promise. They say here, it's God who put you in this place. You are here because of God. Now look at verses 3 through 5. It says, so all the elders of Israel came to the king of Hebron, and King David came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord. And they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. At Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months. And at Jerusalem, he reigned over all Israel in Judah 33 years. And so picture the time frame that we're talking about here. David is 30 years old when Saul dies. He started running away from Saul at age 20. Now, 10 years later, at the age of 30, Saul is dead. And David now has a chance to use his ambition and his army to take the throne. But David chooses to wait on God rather than pursuing his personal ambition. And David does not allow his ambition to get ahead of his plan. And so David goes to Hebron and he waits for over 7 years for God to say it's time. He just goes and waits. Now, there are going to be a lot of other people doing a lot of other things during this time, but David's just there waiting on God, serving as king over Judah, waiting for the time when God says, okay, the promise is going to be realized. You see, he could have asserted his ambition, but instead he chose to go with God's ultimate plan. You see, we see here that David's kingdom is secured. And in chapter 5, we see that ultimately he gets control over all of Israel. But it's actually secured by the ambition and violence of other men. David wasn't involved, but there was going to be a lot of ambition and violence involved over these next 7.5 years. And we're going to move through it very quickly because in between chapters 2 and 5, we find that there are a number of ambitious men who are fighting for power in Israel. And we're going to look at just a few of these. The first is a man by the name of Abner. We've talked about Abner before because Abner was Saul's right-hand man. Man, I'm going to talk all over my words today. He was Saul's right-hand man. He was second in command over Israel. And somehow he survives the battle. And so he gets Saul's remaining son, a man by the name of Ishbosheth, and he makes him king over the northern kingdom, but he's really just a puppet king. The one who's really in control is Abner. He's really running things, and Ishbosheth is just kind of there as a puppet to do Abner's bidding. And so that's what we have in the northern kingdom, but then in the southern kingdom we have David. And David has 3 valiant warriors who just happen to be his nephews, and they're by the names of Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. Now, the leader of the group is Joab, and he's going to end up being David's general, and really serve as David's general throughout his reign. Okay? And what we're going to see now is a blood feud as these brothers begin to jockey and fight for position. So in 2 Samuel 2, verses 8 through 10, we find there that Ishbosheth is crowned king of the northern kingdom, David's crowned king of the southern kingdom, and these two groups begin fighting in a series of skirmishes between one another. And one of these begins in verse 17 of chapter 2. And in this skirmish, David's men start to defeat Abner's army. And we have to picture what's happening here. I encourage you to go back and to read this when you can. But Abner's men begin to run away, and so does Abner. So here's Abner. He's running away from the fight, right? Well, Asahel notices that Abner's running away. And Asahel, in his ambition, gets this idea. He thinks, if I can just kill Abner, the second in command over the northern kingdom, then man, I'm going to win brownie points. That's going to push me in position. That's going to move me up in prominence. I'm going to be better and greater than even Joab. And so he begins to run after Abner. So you have Abner. He's running as fast as he can. He's got a spear in his hand. Then you've got Asahel running behind him. He's running as fast as he can. And Abner begins talking to Asahel. He's kind of yelling behind him, and he says, "Listen, go fight. Go after somebody else. I'm not your enemy. Go after somebody else. Choose somebody else to fight." And see, Abner's reasoning behind this is he knew that if Asahel killed him or he killed Asahel, either way, it was going to cause a huge problem between the two nations, the two groups, and that the feud would just become uncontrollable. And so he did not want to have to do this, but finally, because Asahel in his ambition kept chasing after him, Abner just basically stops, puts his spear out, and lets Asahel run into it, and thrusts his spear through Asahel, killing him. And so what happens as a result of that is a tremendous feud that gets even greater now, because now Abner has assassinated one of David's men. And so in chapter 3, what we find there is that in the northern kingdom, Abner's going through this process of gaining strength, and he's getting stronger and stronger. Ishbosheth begins to get jealous of the situation, and so he begins to lay some accusations against Abner, and he's trying to discredit Abner, and so he accuses him of some things. And finally, Abner has had enough. And so in chapter 3, beginning in verse 9, we have Abner's response. He says this, he says, God do to Abner, and more also, if I do not accomplish for David what the Lord has sworn to him, to transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul and set up for the throne of David over Israel and over Judah, from Dan to Beersheba. And Ishbosheth could not answer Abner another word because he feared him. And so what's happened here is Abner becomes so angry at King Ishbosheth, he basically decides that he wants David to become king. And so in the rest of the chapter, Abner goes to the clan leaders, and he gets them to agree to leave Ishbosheth and to join alliances with David, which would unite the two kingdoms. And so he goes and he meets with David. He and David come to an agreement, and Abner leaves. He goes to go back home, but Joab finds out what's going on, and now Joab is threatened, because guess what? If Abner gets the northern kingdom to join with the south, what happens to Abner? he rises in the ranks, and then what happens to Joab? He's going to decrease. And so suddenly he's not going to be second in command anymore. Now he's going to be under Abner. He doesn't like that, so he concocts this plan, and he calls Abner. He sends a messenger out to get Abner. He says, we need you to come back, and we need to discuss this plan some more. Well, when Abner comes back, he's ambushed, and Joab murders Abner. And so now Abner is out of the picture, but Joab rises in prominence. And as a result of this, though, David now loses the respect of the northern kingdom. And so guess what happens? This alliance that they were going to have, and David was suddenly going to become king over everybody, it's gone. It's all of that's over. And so David has to start all over trying to unite the kingdoms. Why? Because the ambition of a few men was getting in the way of God's purpose. A few men in their ambition was leading them away from God's ultimate purpose. But what we find is that David begins to work to bring unity back to the two nations. Now Ishbosheth is all threatened by this. And so in chapter 4, and we're almost done here, bear with me, but in chapter 4, we find that two men who had been loyal to Ishbosheth kill him. And so now Ishbosheth is dead, and they cut off his head, and they take his head to David. Now, why would they do that? Ambition. Right? They see an opportunity to rise in the ranks, and they think if we can take out David's nemesis, or his rival, and we can present that to David, then that's going to help, lift us up among the people. And so they take the King David, the head of Ishbosheth. But the problem with that is David is also a king. And kings don't take kindly to people who go around killing kings. That's kind of threatening just a little bit. And so what does David do? He has them executed. And so at this point, there's really nobody left but David. And so in chapter 5, they unite the kingdoms and they make David king over Israel. Now, that's a lot of information. But the question this morning is, what does that mean for us? How does any of that apply to us? I think there are 3 principles we see in these events that can help guide us as we deal with ambition in our own lives. And the first principle is this. We must seek God's direction before we move ahead. All through life, we see doors open in our lives. And a lot of times, if it's a door that has something on the other side that we want, we convince ourselves that God's opened that door. But what we have to realize is that not every door is automatically the will of God. Just because an opportunity presents itself doesn't mean it's something that God wills for us. Now, I believe that God opens doors. But I also believe that Satan's pretty good at opening doors as well. The scriptures tell us that Satan's going to open doors for us. And the thing is that Satan doesn't make it plain. He doesn't put his little billboard over it and say, hey, this is me. I want you to come in here. This is a bad idea. What does Satan do? He dresses that door up, right? He makes it attractive. He makes it look like it's a door that God has opened for you. Because he knows that if he can convince you that it's a door that God's opened up for you, you're going to go through it, and he's got something waiting for you on the other side. And yet, if it's something that we want in our lives, somehow we convince ourselves that, well, it's an opportunity. Obviously, it's what God wants for us. And here's David as we go through the story. David has a door that has opened for him. He can go and he can take the throne, and he can take it now. But what does he do? David stops and he prays. He inquires of God. In other words, David exercises patience, and he waits for another 7.5 years. Why? Because God told him to. He had the opportunity to go through that door, but instead, he sought God's direction. There are going to be a lot of opportunities for us to pursue ambition in our lives. But we need to stop and ask God if it's His will. We need to really focus on those opportunities and make sure that we're doing them for the right reasons and the right way. And so we need to seek God's direction before we move ahead. But then the second principle that we see here is that today's self-indulgence can become tomorrow's nightmare. You see, a lot of times we like to indulge in things in life just because we want them. And it seems harmless. It seems like it's a good thing. But there could be a great price to pay down the road. And in 2 Samuel 2 and verse 3, we have David's family listed there. And in that family are 7 wives that David had at that point. 7. Now, he takes on some more later on, but he has 7 wives. What's happening? Well, David is allowing his desires and politics to drive his behavior. Some of these wives were taken because he just had the desire for them. Others, it was just politically expedient because he was making alliances with different nations. And so that's the way they did it then. And so he took wives for these different reasons. And all that seems very harmless, right? And yet, David's behavior here is going to lead to 3 very troublesome things down the road. One is it's going to lead to his affair with Bathsheba that he acted on just because he was doing what he had always done, acted on his desires. And that affair then led him to committing murder. It's also going to lead to all of David's children from all these different wives fighting for power, and some of them betraying David. And then it also is going to lead to like father, like son, because who ended up following David after his reign? His son, King Solomon. And if you think David had a little problem with giving in to his desires, that ain't nothing compared to Solomon, right? But where did Solomon learn it? He learned it from his dad. And so we have to be very careful to realize that the self-indulgences of today can lead to tremendous consequences down the road. The Apostle Paul says it this way in Galatians chapter 6, verses 7 and 8. Galatians 6, verses 7 and 8, he says, "Do not be deceived, God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that will he also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption, but the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life." What does Paul say here? Paul says, be careful about your indulgences because they could turn into a nightmare. In other words, we're going to pay the price for later for the mistakes that we make today. There are consequences to our choices. David understood that on some occasions, and other times he didn't. And we struggle with that same point as well in our lives, and so we need to recognize that we need to stop and question and ask God. But then we also need to understand that when we indulge in our own desires for ambition, there could be dire consequences later. But then the final point this morning, and the lesson will be yours, is that we are called to trust God in a world of crazy ambition. You know, I find myself at times asking, what am I supposed to do when I'm in a world where everybody's out for themselves? What am I supposed to do when everybody is in the world out for themselves, trying to achieve, trying to get to the top, no matter what that requires, no matter what that takes? And you know, shouldn't I just join them and be out for myself just like everybody else? You know, I'm reminded of the story of the two young boys who were out cave exploring, spelunking. And they went into the wrong cave on one occasion and woke up a bear that had been sleeping. And so the two boys start running out of as fast as they can. And one of the boys stops and he starts tying his shoes. And the other boy looks behind him and he says, "What are you doing?" He said, "The bear's going to get you." He said, "No, I don't need to outrun the bear. I've just got to outrun you." And how many of us live our lives that way? Thinking that all we have to do is just be out for ourselves and get there before the other guy does. And, you know, we have this mindset of just, let's push the other guy aside because we've got to take care of ourselves. Folks, do you trust God? Do you trust God to take care of you? David was in a position where he could move himself up to be king. He would be ruler over a nation. And yet he decided to trust God and wait. To wait for time. Wait his turn. Wait in line. How many of you like potluck meals? You know, in the church over the years, we've been famous during the COVID years. It used to be COVID months. It's now COVID years. We haven't done a lot of the potlucks, but we love potlucks, and I love to sit back and watch. And the reason why I love to watch is because there are some people that have in their minds that even though we have food to feed 5,000 people and we have 50 people in the room, there's not going to be enough food for them. And so they run to get in front of the line, right? They got to be up front. They got to be up first, And this idea that somehow there's not going to be enough. And my thing is, hey, there's plenty. Don't worry. God's message, I'll be interested to see the next potluck meal and how many people right now. But God's message to you is, there's plenty. I've taken care of you. You don't have to worry. There is a feast that is laid out for you, a spiritual feast. Why? Because Jesus' message, Christ's message to us, is that while we were yet sinners, He died for us. You see, if we've given our lives to Jesus Christ, we don't have to worry. There's enough. There's more than enough because Christ is taking care of it for us. The question is, do we trust Him enough to let go of our personal ambitions and our personal desire to think that we've got to take care of it ourselves and push our way to the top and just trust that He's got us? God's timing is always right. God's timing is always perfect. And God has taken care of our needs. This week has been a challenging week for several of us. And, for me, here trying to navigate all the different things, it was interesting because about 6 o'clock Monday morning, got a call from the cleaning guy. And he calls me and he says, Bill, he says, there's a little water in the auditorium. So I get on the cameras, and on my phone, I get on the cameras and look, and there was a little water in the auditorium. About that much. All the way through it, right? And I panic, and I get over here as fast as I can, and he had already gotten the water shut off at that point, and then we started, trying to figure out what we were going to do. And I was getting a little anxious, and then I finally had to kind of stop myself and say, Bill, this is nothing. This is just stuff, right? And we have a responsibility to take care of it and do what's best, with the things that God has given us. But it's just stuff. And here we are this morning, and guess what we're still doing? We're still worshiping. We're still serving. That's not going to stop. And guess what happens if this building floods? And nobody better do it. But if this building floods, we'll put a tent out here, and guess what we'll do next week? We'll still be here. We'll still be worshiping. We'll still be serving. Why? Because Christ gave Himself for us. Amen. We've got nothing to worry about, folks. We are a blessed people. And so, yes, we should strive with the ambition to grow spiritually. We should strive with the ambition to share the message of the gospel with those who are lost. We should strive with ambition to be the very best person for Christ that we can possibly be. But when it comes to trying to survive in this world, folks, He's got this. He's taking care of us here, and He's taking care of us eternally. The question this morning is, are you in relationship with Jesus Christ? Have you given your life to Christ? Have you been baptized for the remission of your sins and been added to the Lord's church and becoming part of the family of God? Because you see, it's at that point that we come into relationship, and it is at that point that our personal ambitions are set aside, because it is about the spiritual ambitions that we have in relationship with Him. This morning, let go of the giant of ambition and simply trust in God. If you're subject to the invitation, I invite you to come as we stand together and as we sing.